Well, good morning and welcome everybody to Elevenses. It's show number 268 on Sunday, the 4th of September. Looking out to the window here in Scotland, the rain appears to have stopped, which is a bonus. We've actually had some lovely weather up here, a bit of an unexpected holiday, but anyway, we should be back to normal in London in a few days' time. What I've got for you today, well, we've got a story about bikejackers targeting an Edinburgh bike trainer and his trainee, which is frankly alarming. Hackney is being said to be getting a road charging scheme. We'll be looking at the actual facts behind that story, but Hackney, there is definitely a bike parking protest ride going on, which I will also let you know about. We'll have a quick look at aluminium sulphur batteries and how they could be safer and cheaper, and whether or not they'll make their way into an automotive application, I don't yet know, but we'll investigate the technology at least. Fred Warr has died. If you know anything about Harley Davidsons in the UK, you've undoubtedly heard of Warrs of Fulham. And finally, today's discussion point, one that I actually puzzled over myself, is whatever happened to shaft drive on middleweight motorcycles. So settle yourselves down for the next 30 minutes or so. I appear to have frozen there for a moment. Hopefully that's not going to happen through the show. Do remember, if you want to drop me a line, comment or anything, I'll try to get back to you during the show as I am delivering it. If I can't, I will try to answer you at the end of the show. Anything you want to ask, basically, drop me a line. Now, we have Sue looking in, and Clive also here at the moment saying hello. So good morning to you both, and good morning to anybody else who drops in later. Don't forget, if you do miss the show live, you can always get it here on Facebook. It also goes out on my YouTube channel, and you can find it over there at youtube.com/Survival Skills UK. Don't forget that all important UK though. We will get some alternative channel. All right, okay, so on with the first bit of news. Don't forget, I will be home on Wednesday and delivering the September live online talk event, and that one's on riding systems as well. And what I'll be talking about in this particular talk is what actually a riding system is meant to achieve, and how that determines what the system should be, rather than the other way around, which is starting with a system, trying to fit your riding into the system. I'll explain the difference between the two, and I'll explain why riding systematically is the important thing, rather than which riding system we use, and why we shouldn't get hung up on roadcraft and information, position, speed, gear, acceleration. There are alternatives out there. Right, so that is Wednesday. That's 7th of September, of course, 8 o'clock in the evening. Tickets cost £5, and you can get them from the usual online booking source, which is here. I'm just going to put that up in the comments for you so you know exactly where it is. And Christine's also looked in. Good morning to you, Christine. Thank you for coming along this morning while I'm up in Scotland. Right, funnily enough, as I am in Scotland, the first news story is actually from up here too. It's a pretty shocking incident, actually. An Edinburgh bike instructor has been attacked by a gang who attempted to kick him off his bike. The instructor, who's named only as Fraser, the report was in the Edinburgh Evening News. He was apparently on the A7 near the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary with his trainee when four youths wearing tracksuits and balaclavas zoomed out of a junction on electric bikes. And he told the Edinburgh Evening News, "Immediately I knew this was no normal encounter with some lads acting a bit silly on bikes." He said they began to harass my novice trainee rider with their bikes, intimidating him by coming dangerously close to his bike and braking in front of him. Fraser went on to explain that when he tried to protect them with his own machine, one of them actually collided with his bike, and all four of them then began to attack me, kicking out at me and my bike, trying to knock me off, shouting, "Get him off, get him off." Now, it seems that the attack actually continued for some time, with the trainee and trainer being chased around the roundabout. And Fraser says they attempted to put me into a wall and then a parked car. That must have been a pretty terrifying experience, actually. You know, I think most motorcycle trainers have probably had an angry encounter with the driver or something, but I've never actually been physically attacked. I've certainly had drivers swerve at me. One indeed tried to knock me off at one point, obviously not liking the fact I was out with 4 trainees. But I've never been physically attacked like that. And the managing director of the training school involved at Two Wheels commented, "My staff are now nervous and I'm very concerned for their safety. Do I now have to send them out in pairs? Do I invest in tracking tools, cameras, etc.? What should they do when surrounded by balaclava wearing bikers?" Well, all of those are actually very good questions. I mean, at the end of the day, what do you do if you are physically attacked? Do you fight back? You know, how are you going to fight back against 4 people if there's only 2 of you? You obviously can't carry weapons or anything like that for very obvious reasons. Tracking tools might help you get the bike back, ultimately, if it's been stolen. Video footage, well, not much use if they're wearing masks and balaclavas and things. So what really worries me about this story is that other criminal types are going to hear about this. The word will get around very, very quickly indeed. And what I'm worried about is that they will start thinking that other rider training schools generally are soft targets. Now, Fraser was actually lucky. He was actually dealing with just one trainee out on the road, and not 2, as you would on a direct access course. And you can even take more than that on a CBT road ride. So that is quite an alarming development, I think. Sorry, you can't take more than that on a CBT road ride. That you can take them out if they're qualified on CBTs, but they're on 125s on L plates. That's a bit of a loophole that some training schools exploit. Right, okay, so yeah, any thoughts on that? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. I could imagine that if you were learning to ride and you had an incident like that, it would be absolutely scary. Now, anyway, last time out, I did mention that many stories that we find in the press these days are either inaccurate in one way or another, or are simply clickbait. And sometimes what happens is a story will be spun to deliver a particular point of view that the editor believes will appeal to readers. And of course, we probably know that all too well through the press, the mainstream press. But it's interesting that actually 2 stories appeared in the motorcycle press over the last couple of days, neither which was particularly accurate in terms of their reporting. Now, the first one I spotted was actually in the best-selling weekly Motorcycle News, in which Phil West, billed as an MCN contributor, I think he's been writing for MCN for many years actually, he wrote, "Major updates were supposed to make life safer for the bikers, but in reality, nothing much has changed." Now, what he was talking about was, of course, the highway code that was revised back at the beginning of this year. And he continued, "The revised code was introduced on January the 29th, following calls for extra protection for the likes of pedestrians, cyclists, horse riders, and motorcyclists. It was described as the biggest change to the document in years." Now, you probably recall, if you're a regular here, that I actually spent quite a lot of time discussing the changes to the highway code earlier this year. And whilst there was indeed a new hierarchy of harm, where the road users capable of doing the most damage, i.e. trucks and coaches and that kind of thing, they have a responsibility to protect those liable to suffer the most harm. So those down the bottom of the hierarchy in terms of threat are the highest in terms of risk, so cyclists, pedestrians, horse riders, and motorcyclists too. But I did point out at the time that the big changes were aimed at offering extra protection for cyclists and pedestrians. And I even said that given the status of motorcyclists as vulnerable road users, there was nothing really in those road rule changes aimed at offering extra protection to motorcyclists. And the fact is, those major changes were about how vehicles, including motorcyclists, should be treating cyclists and pedestrians. So what really frustrates me about stories like this, saying that nothing's changed and that there were big changes in improving the safety of motorcyclists, is not only is it not actually entirely accurate, it's somewhat dishonest in some ways to even try to imply that that was the case. But what happens as a result of this is, of course, it's an open invitation to riders themselves, those who see themselves as victims within the road use system, to complain that they haven't got the benefits that they were wanting to get out of it. Now, they were never there. That's the most important thing. And Phil West continued, changes to the highway code intended to boost safety are receiving a further publicity drive amid concerns they've made little difference, have created confusion, and are mostly being ignored. Well, if you ask me, motorcyclists are just as guilty as any other road user at ignoring the revised rules. I've seen a motorcyclist just recently turn into a side turning and not give way to a pedestrian already crossing the road, as you're now supposed to do. In fact, making that pedestrian jump backwards as the motorcycle passed and very close indeed in front of them. So, yeah, it's easy to blame drivers. It's easy to blame everybody else for the ills of motorcycling in the world. But, you know, we have to fix ourselves before we can rely on anybody else to fix things for us. So that's the motorcycle news story. A few days later, I came across another story, this time on the online magazine Visor Down, one where I used to be a moderator of one of the sections. It's then, a big contributor before it became a commercial enterprise. And what they trumpeted in capital letters was new London road use charge to be trialled in Hackney. Now, this story was penned by one Alex Whitworth, who claimed that Hackney Council will trial a new road use charge system that will adjust the charge based on a number of factors, including congestion and the time of day. Now, in reading that, you would expect that this is actually on the cards and about to happen, but the truth is actually subtly different. What has happened in reality is that the London Borough of Hackney has actually volunteered to host the first UK pilot of a next generation road charging system, which is said to allow a just transition to net zero carbon by pricing the use of internal combustion powered engines according to factors such as income, disability and journey purpose. Now, the borough would therefore become the first trial area for this new zero emissions scheme, which London Mayor Sadiq Khan is actually hoping to roll out in central London by 2025. But as far as I understand it, the roads pricing scheme would be somewhat different to the 2025 zero emissions scheme. So there is a sort of a confusion between the two events there. Now, the council, actually Hackney Council, have actually said that unless road charging happens, then simply a blanket ban on anything other than zero emissions vehicles is actually, they said, quote, just a scheme for improving motoring conditions for the rich. Now, Visor Down did actually point out the irony that Hackney are talking here about a means-based approach to roads pricing, whilst at the same time they're planning, of course, to charge motorcycles exactly the same as they currently charge cars for parking. More on that in a moment. But the key point is this is a trial that is being talked about. They have volunteered to be the first stage of that trial, and there's no guarantee that it will go ahead. Sadiq Khan has himself said that any such scheme is many years away from being ready to be implemented. Now, sadly, the BMF themselves, British Motorcycle Federation, who really should know better, in my opinion, seem to have used the report as an opportunity to attack the Labour mayor, with Chair Jim Freeman saying it's simply to rescue the finances of Transport for London. And to quote him, he says, the dire state of TfL's finances continues to drive what appear to be increasingly desperate attempts to increase revenue. People are literally voting with their feet despite the coercion, not enough of walking, cycling or using public transport. Well, what can I say to that? Well, clearly Mr. Freeman hasn't followed the saga of London's funding problems, which arose because of the need to keep public transport running during COVID. Now, I don't want to use this broadcast as a political platform, and I don't want to talk about the disparity between the level of funding from central government, which London receives as a subsidy, or to compare that with other cities across the UK and across Europe. But the fact is that TfL transports millions of people from within London and from outside London to and from work every day, and for recreational purposes, of course, going to the theatre in the evenings, that kind of thing. The tube alone handles around 5 million journeys every day. Has Mr. Freeman even begun to consider what would happen if a fraction of those people who currently make their journeys on public transport switched to cars or even motorcycles? Now, COVID had a huge impact on a network that was actually previously running at a profit. Let's not get this wrong. The stories have been spun in the press to say that TfL is a failing organisation. It wasn't. TfL was actually making a profit, and in the last few years it has made significant inroads into the debt that it was left from the former administration under Boris Johnson. So unfortunately, what happened, of course, with COVID is that the network was required to continue to run to deliver vital workers to their jobs during lockdown, and the need to run those services while carrying very few passengers massively impacted TfL's finances. It ate into their working reserve, demolished it, and it's also gone through some grants from government. But many of the changes that you're seeing in London at the moment are conditions that the government has set on London. These aren't choices being made easily by Sadiq Khan or TfL. So excuse me for getting on my hobby horse here, but frankly, the BMF should rethink their attack on Sadiq Khan and the TfL, because it sounds politically motivated to me, and that's not the function of a rider rights group. There is a difference. Fight for rider rights by all means, but don't make it political. Right, my hobby horse, I'm off it for the moment. Yes, Claire's looked in this morning. Good to see you here, Claire. Thank you for coming along. Right, now, if there is a case, I'm back to Hackney again, if there is a case for motorcyclists to be outraged with Hackney, then it is actually over the incoming bike parking charges. Now, I've covered these in an earlier show, but in short, the plan is to charge not just locals, but also visiting riders who want to park up their bikes in the borough. And to me, this policy, as I said at the time when I covered this in more detail, it does seem to me to be a policy which is aimed at directly deterring the use of powered two-wheelers in Hackney. The charges are swinging. They are the same basically as parking a car, £6 an hour. But the key point is that Hackney's plans would also mean maximum stay limits for vehicles that currently apply to cars would now be also applied to motorcycles. And basically what that amounts to is a ban on commuting by motorcycle into most parts of Hackney. Now, what's actually baffling in the light of their support for means-based road pricing, which they talk about as being fair and equitable, is the fact that zero emissions scooters and motorcycles are still required to pay these parking charges for residents in residence bays and generally in parking bays where motorcycles can park free for all, as it were. So the news here is that there is a protest. Let me just get the picture up for you. I meant to get this prepared a moment ago and didn't quite get to do it. So there we go. Here we are. There is a picture coming up any moment now. Yes, there we go, of a parking protest ride. So that is 10th of September. I think that's the correct date. I know they did have to change it from the Sunday to the Saturday, so just double check that. I think that's correct. 12 noon, starting, as it says there, from Downs Park Road, which is out in East 5 in Hackney. If you want the latest gen on the event, you can find it here on the Facebook page. The link is just going up in the comments section. The protest is going to be dual organised by Save London Motorcycling and MAG. So do have a look at that. And if you're in the London area and you feel like you want to support what I think is actually an important event, then head along. I sometimes do worry that I am a bit London centric in these shows. But frankly, the reason is that if it happens in London, it will happen sooner or later outside London. Right, okay. So just a couple of reminders. Don't forget you are tuned to Elevenses. Kevin Williams here of Survival Skills. If you do enjoy the show, you can pop over to my Ko-fi page, support me over there. A cuppa keeps me coming back and doing more of these shows. It also gets you access to hundreds, literally hundreds of better biking articles from my Facebook archive 2012 to 2022. I'm currently finishing the last year that's incomplete, which is 2020. All the others are up there. Well, 2022 is as far as we are into the year. So do pop over there, do have a look. There's plenty of free stuff to read, and if you do find it useful, cuppa won't go unappreciated. So, okay, battery power. Now, we're talking here about zero emissions. We're talking about parking. A bizarre decision by Hackney not to allow electric vehicles, electric motorcycles to park for free. Of course, there are objections to battery power, and some of the common ones are, apart from the fact they don't make the right noise and the fact that the electricity has to be generated somewhere else, is that the components of the battery need to be mined. And many people are pointing out that this isn't actually a particularly environmentally sound process. So here is some interesting news. Last week, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, announced via an article in the journal Nature that an aluminium sulfur battery could provide low-cost battery technology. Now, at the moment, it's being talked about as a backup storage for renewable energy sources, but the new battery developed by the researchers at MIT and elsewhere is made entirely from abundant and inexpensive materials. Uses aluminium and sulfur as its two electrodes, and there is a molten salt electrolyte in between them. Now, MIT professor Donald Sadoway, who was a researcher on the project, he wrote in this article in Nature, "I wanted to invent something that was better, much better than lithium-ion batteries for small-scale stationary storage and ultimately for automotive use." Now, aluminium is actually the most abundant metal on Earth, and once you've actually mined it, it's actually quite cheap to keep reprocessing it, which is a big bonus. Sulfur is actually the cheapest non-metal, and it's even a waste product from processes such as petroleum refining. So one of the other issues with lithium-ion batteries is that they use a volatile, flammable organic liquid inside the battery, which is sealed in. And when that escapes, that's what sometimes has led to some pretty bad fires. So new battery technology actually uses a non-flammable molten salt. Now, molten salt does sound pretty horrible, doesn't it? Quite dangerous in itself, but actually it has a relatively low melting point, the salt that they have developed, and it actually is molten at a temperature close to boiling water. Now, obviously you still don't want to touch boiling water, but it's not that hot in real terms. And what this basically means is the batteries don't require special insulation and corrosion measures. And as Sadoway says, the thing is safe, it cannot burn. Now, tests have shown that the battery cells themselves could endure hundreds of cycles at exceptionally high charging rates. And they have a projected per cell cost of just 1/6 of that of comparable lithium-ion batteries, and they do allow, as they said, for very rapid charging. Sadoway says we did experiments with very high charging rates, charging in less than a minute, and he said we never lost cells. Now the problem is when you fast charge a conventional lithium-ion battery, you get something called dendritic shorting. I'm not entirely au fait with what that is, but apparently this new molten salt, overcomes that problem. So the cells can charge very, very quickly indeed, and it doesn't damage the cell, so they presumably maintain their battery life well. And the other interesting bit is that the cell doesn't require any external heat source to bring it up to operating temperature. The heat is actually produced inside the battery electrochemically. When you charge it, that generates heat and keeps the battery at the ideal operating temperature, and when you discharge it, that also produces heat, so that stops the salt from solidifying again. Now, whether that is actually a battery technology which could move to vehicles isn't entirely clear. Sadoway, as I say, describes their use as storage, and where he sees them being useful for automotive technology is vehicle charging stations, which basically means you could dump power into an existing battery, but it would be stored in one of these aluminium sulphur batteries. But who knows, maybe they could move to being used in vehicles too, and then they're not only much cheaper, they also have that very fast charging time, so that would be absolutely perfect. Now, anything else to say? Don't forget the talk that I'm delivering on Wednesday night. That's the one on riding systems. I've already given you the link to go for that, but that'll be 8 o'clock, so do sign up for that if you want to find out something a little bit more about systems, a little bit more in depth than you'll usually find. Now, if you rode a Harley in the London area, you would undoubtedly have come across Warr's Harley Davidson in the King's Road. Now, the dealership is not actually just the oldest Harley Davidson dealership in Europe, it's also said to be the biggest. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, I have had zero interest in Harleys pretty much throughout, but I always heard good things about the shop. But sadly, Fred Warr passed away earlier, or actually just last month. Who was Fred and what was his connection with Warrs? Well, I did actually crib a bit of history from their official website, which I thought you just might be interested in. Warrs was founded on the King's Road in 1924 by Captain Frederick James Warr, and it became an official Harley-Davidson dealer that same year. Now, back then, the flagship of the Harley range was a bike called the Silent Grey Fellow, which is rather ironic given the predilection for current Harley owners to fit loud exhaust to their bike, but it would have set you back £85 at the time, which is a fairly whacking amount of money. Now, in 1949, FJ's son Fred went to work for his father after a spell in the Air Force, and initially post-war, the business concentrated on selling and servicing ex-military surplus WL750s, and that was because trade restrictions prevented new Harleys being exported to the UK. Now, Fred Jr. Campaigned long and hard against both the US Senate and the British government to have those restrictions lifted. And eventually he was successful, and in 1956, the first new civilian Harleys since 1939 arrived at the King's Road dealership, and John Warr has been managing director of that particular business since 1990. Fred himself, he became a founding member of the Harley-Davidson Riders Club of Great Britain in 1949. The company has been used to supply bikes for movies, and Fred even doubled apparently as Marianne Faithfull in the 1968 movie Girl on a Motorcycle. So next time that's on, I'll have to watch out for him posing as Marianne Faithfull. It sort of rather beggars belief. She was particularly slender and tiny. Anyway, hey ho. From the 1940s to the early 70s, Warrs was the only official outlet for Harley-Davidson in the UK, and in 2014, at a ceremony in Nashville, Tennessee, Warrs were actually honoured by the Harley-Davidson Motor Company for outstanding loyalty and dedication to the brand, 90 years of sales and service. So I'm sure Fred will be missed by many Harley-Davidson owners and fans around the country. Another motorcycle which you may recall is Hesketh Motorcycles, founded by Lord Hesketh himself. Now, back in 1980, Hesketh planned to revive the failing British motorcycle industry. Now, he came from a background of F1 racing. He actually ran the last private team to win a Grand Prix, a Formula One Grand Prix. According to Wikipedia, I looked up this morning, and that was with James Hunt at the wheel. Now, Hesketh was aiming to build a quality motorcycle, so a 1000cc V-twin was developed from a Westlake engine. That was running by 1980 in prototype form, and the company was launched to manufacture the bike in Daventry in 1982. Sadly, the machine was, it was sort of moderately well received by the press, but it was also overweight, and it turned out to be very unreliable. It was never a success, and of course it was also in low volume production. So the Hesketh lurched along for a couple of years. The original company collapsed later in 1982. Hesketh himself bought the rights from the company back from the receiver, relaunched the company, and that reborn version of Hesketh actually failed in 1984. The name was then sold on again, and fewer than 200 of those early 1000cc bikes were actually made. Now in 2014, the new owner built a 1900cc V-twin based on a US-made motor. But this particular motorcycle was built in incredibly limited quantities. Just 24 of these were manufactured. But now the Hesketh company is actually looking at building something which they say will be mass market. I'm not quite sure about that, but we'll see why. So this is a glimpse of what is called the Heresy, and it's their first all-new bike since that £35,000 V-twin from a decade ago. It says they're still hoping they'll build a 200 horsepower supercharged triple, but for the time being, this seems to be what they're aiming for. Now, if you think that looks a bit like a Honda, you're absolutely right. I looked at it and immediately thought that was a Honda, and it is. It apparently is an updated, fuel-injected Euro 5 compliant version of the XR400 Enduro. The twin port single there comes complete with a balancer shaft, and the motor sits in a handcrafted tubular steel frame. Now it's got twin shocks at the rear, slightly weird looking laid down ones, but hey ho. The upside down forks at the front don't really match the twin shock rear end. There is a belly pan and a fly screen, everything painted black, and the scrambler version is said to be based on that particular motor and in the pipeline. If you want to think about saving up some pennies in the piggy bank towards one, you'll need about £14,000 worth of them. Now, it's being touted as a bike that won't end up sat in a collection, and it will be ridden. That's what they hope, unlike most of the big V-twins, which have disappeared into museums or sit on people's carpets in their living room. But frankly, for a 450cc single, which will probably pump out somewhere around about 40 odd horsepower, I think that's still quite a lot to pay. Right, on to today's final point. Now, that 400cc engine and the 450 Hesketh derivative were chain drive. And traditionally, single-cylinder bikes have been a bit heavy-duty on chains. They do tend to knock them to pieces. My old 250 Honda single chains at a rate of knots, and the 500 XBR I had and the 650 Dominator also weren't exactly light on chains. Now, the alternative to a chain, there is the belt drive. There are one or two bikes that use a belt drive, not very many at all. But what about the shaft? Why don't we have more shaft drives on motorcycles? Now, talk shaft, and most people will immediately think BMW. The history of the shaft drive actually goes back quite a long way. I do remember years and years and years ago going to see the London to Brighton run, and one of the bikes I was really taken with was an FN, a Belgian-built machine. It was a four-cylinder, all the cylinders in line with the bike rather than being across the frame as you would get with something like my 404. But interestingly, the exhaust note was almost exactly the same as my 404. But the inline motor drove the rear wheel through a shaft drive. Go a little bit further into the future, and you'll find bikes like the Velocette LE, which was a sort of fairly lightweight sort of commuting machine, and the Sunbeam S3, I think it was, also used shaft drives. So back in the 1970s and 80s, I noticed that shaft drives started to come in on middleweight bikes, and this is an interesting thing because, funnily enough, whilst I was actually starting to think about using this topic for today's show, I actually happened to look at an article in Motorcycle News, and there was a question written by someone that read like this: "Greetings. In the late 1970s and early 80s, I was a motorcycle courier." That sounds like a familiar occupation. The choice of bike was the Honda CX500. around that time and through most of the 80s, there were a lot of mid-sized motorcycles with shaft drives. I eventually sold it and haven't ridden since. I'm retired now and looking to get back into motorcycling and do some touring on a mid-range shaft drive bike. And they don't seem to exist anymore except for Moto Guzzi. So what happened to the mid-range shaft drive? Very good question. And I did actually have a quick look to see which bikes actually had shaft drives at the time. Now, obviously the CX500, the VT500 were definitely up there as shaft drives, but Yamaha also put the shaft drive on quite a few bikes, the XJ650 being one, the XV535, that was their custom V-twin, the long forgotten, for good reason actually, the XZ550, that was a strange V-twin, but that had a shaft drive too. The Diversion 900, of course, was an incredibly popular machine with a shaft drive, and there are a few others around that you can find if you look. Obviously, some of the bikes that went out to America, there was CP700 that had a shaft. Later on, the Deauville had a shaft, and there were various 750s, which were also the Sabre. I think that was a 750, wasn't it? There was an American one with a shaft drive, and of course the mighty Kawasaki Z1300 also had a shaft drive. So some of those were not exactly middleweight. So what are the benefits and disbenefits of a shaft? Well, it's usually said that the benefit of a shaft drive is it's lower maintenance, lower running cost, and it's clean. The problem is, of course, as long as it works, and if it doesn't work, then shaft drives get very, very expensive to fix indeed. And certainly the CX had a reputation for the shaft drive lasting as long as the rest of the bike would do. Usually outlived the engine, but certainly BMW back in the 90s had a bit of a reputation for having fairly unreliable shaft drives, and with failures being noted. And when that went wrong, yes, it got very expensive indeed. I think I mentioned in a story just recently about how there is a retrofit for some mechanism for testing the oil or something in the shaft drive. I forget exactly what, but there's a recall gone out on BMWs. Even now, they do get water in the shaft drive. That's what it was. It was a drain valve, wasn't it, to let out condensation. So, comparatively speaking, people will say if they like if they have a shaft drive, that the disadvantage of the chain drive is that the chain wears out regularly. They are expensive to replace when they wear out, and they need lubrication, of course, which is a problem in poor weather. So, is that exactly true? Well, most chains, actually, modern chains, if you look after them even cursorily, should be good for 20,000 miles or more. I've had 50,000 out of an X-Rink chain. And when you do come to change the chain, a chain really isn't that expensive. Okay, a top of the range DID or something will probably set you back £120 plus the cost of sprockets, but that's still relatively cheap compared with the problems of replacing a shaft drive. The X-ring chains, yes, they still need external lubrication, but the whole point of the sealing rings is that they keep the lube sealed in the chain. So as long as you keep the chain moist on the outside, the lube stays on the inside. So you don't need to use lots and lots of chain spray. Most people way over to spray their chain. That's why it ends up all over the bike. You don't need to do that, and that can keep the back of the bike a lot cleaner. However, having said that, the old CX500 of mine was spotless on the back, and certainly my existing bike isn't. They are lighter, of course, chains. They consume less power, and you can change gearing as well. So there are advantages for chains. Anything else that's a problem for a shaft drive? Well, it's a lot heavier than a chain, and it does absorb more power. Now, that really accounts for the issues of why chains are fitted to sports bikes. But precisely why they're not fitted to medium weight tourers anymore, I really don't know. The XJ6 diversion that I've got will be a perfect candidate for a shaft drive, frankly. It's not over powerful. It doesn't really matter if you put a bit of extra weight on the back end, because it's not a light bike to start with. And the fact that the shaft absorbs a few more horsepower from a relatively lowly powered engine isn't going to make a great deal of difference. Anything else? Well, shaft drives, they have a cogging effect, which you will be used to if you're a rider of a shaft drive. When you open the throttle, the bike actually tries to climb up at the back. It tries to climb over the rear wheel. Quite fun sitting there at a standstill, blipping the throttle, because the back end will go up and down. But generally speaking, do they affect the handling? Well, I haven't noticed. The V-twin CX was supposed to have the engine rotating in one direction to counter out the rotational force of the shaft on the other side. The V-twin Moto Guzzi didn't have that effect, and so when you blip the throttle, there was the bike rocks to the side. But again, it's not really a big issue. So really, if you want a middleweight motorcycle with a shaft, it seems to be the V-twin Moto Guzzi, which is about your only choice. There is the little V75s and there's the bigger V85. Yeah, that's about it really. So where the shaft drives are, I don't know why we don't come back to them. I don't know either. It would seem to me to be quite a desirable feature for a middleweight motorcycle. Will we see shaft drives on electric bikes? Again, I don't know. I suspect probably not, because most of them at the moment being made by startups, and investing in the tooling, I suspect, for a shaft is probably quite expensive. And obviously a lot easier to buy a chain off the shelf and bolt a couple of sprockets onto the bike, or just use a belt. Right, that is it for today. All will be resumed as normal back from my base in London on Sunday, when I should see you again at 11 o'clock. Sunday? It is Sunday. Wednesday will be the next show, won't it? So yeah, we'll see you on Wednesday with the next show. Thank you very much for looking in. If you've got any comments, questions, puzzles, do drop me a line. If you like or dislike shafts, I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say about those. It's one of those topics that seems to polarize opinion. So let me know what you think about shaft drive. And if you've got any comments on that Edinburgh bike jacking attempt as well, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that. So once again, I'm Kevin Williams of Survival Skills Rider Training. This is my show, Elevenses. This is a special on-the-road version from Scotland. I'll be back in the studio on Wednesday, when I shall see you hopefully at 11 o'clock. But till then, if you're out and about on your bike today, stay shiny side up out there.